Good afternoon, everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon when the sun's out in Chicago for the IOP's latest speaker series event, The Voting Power of Gen Z Realized, Is the Youth Vote Finally Making Inroads? My name is Hina Mohammed. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the Harris School of Public Policy. I serve as a graduate assistant at the IOP, and I lead the Bridge program where University of Chicago students work with incarcerated youth and adults, including delivering voter rights training at Cook County Jail. I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's brilliant panel to discuss the power of the youth vote, something I know that we're all actively thinking about in Chicago in the run-up to the municipal election. We're joined here today by Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, who is currently serving as the representative for Michigan's 7th District, a district that knows exactly the power of the youth vote as the home of Michigan State University and was identified in 2022 as one of the races most susceptible to youth numbers in the nation. Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin is a national security leader and a lifelong public servant. Following the 9/11 attack, she was recruited to join the CIA as a Middle East analyst. She served 3 tours in Iraq and held a variety of defense and intelligence roles under both President Bush and President Obama. Congresswoman Slotkin flipped her district blue in 2018 and successfully defended it in both 2020 and 22. I was honored to have worked on Congresswoman's most successful re-election campaign. Joining Congresswoman Slotkin is Gen Z voting activist Victor Shi. Victor was the youngest elected delegate for Joe Biden in 2020. He's a writer, speaker, organizer, activist, podcast co-host, and full-time student. Victor began his time in politics in 8th grade as a campaign intern for Congressman Brad Schneider, and during high school was selected as one of 30 students to serve on Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's Emerging Youth Leaders Transition Team. We're also joined by Jack Lobel. Jack serves as the Deputy Communications Director for Voters of Tomorrow, a Gen Z-led organization focused on mobilizing young voters. Voters of Tomorrow worked closely on the 22 Georgia U.S. Senate runoff, in which Gen Z voters came out more than their millennial peers. And finally, moderating our panel this afternoon is our very own brilliant IOP student leader, Estrella Hernandez. Estrella is a 4th year in the college, double majoring in global studies and law, letters, and society. She's currently serving as the co-chair of the IOP Student Advisory Board. She serves U.S. Votes as special projects lead, and she also leads on the IOP Bridge program's efforts to help people vote in pretrial detention. A few notes for housekeeping. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent. We will make a microphone available for questions. Stay seated, and then we'll tell you when it's time, and we'll come over with a microphone. As usual, we will give priority for the first questions to students. I'm going to note 2 upcoming events for the IOP Speaker Series. Next week on the Wednesday, 15th of February, we'll be celebrating Black History Month with an event on the power of Black mayors in American cities, featuring Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell, and current Pritzker Fellow and former Shreveport Mayor Adrian Perkins. The event will be moderated by former IOP Fellow and former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. On the 24th of February, we're holding an event titled Reforming Police, Building Trust, Unpacking Chicago's New Police District Councils, and we'll be joined by Isaac Troncoso and Oswaldo Gomez to talk about the city's new police district councils, which is going to be on the ballot for the first time in the Chicago municipal elections. And it's the first time we'll be allowing Chicagoans to have a direct say in policing in this city. This event will be held on Friday the 24th in the IOP living room. You can register for all our events online. Finally, I just want to remind students and all visitors that the Chicago mayoral election will be held in just over 2 weeks on Tuesday, February 28th. If you need any support to votes, please reach out to our U.S. Votes team at ushvotes.com, and I know some of them are floating around in the room if you want to chat to them later. Thank you for bearing with me through that, and with that, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests.
So thank you again to our panelists for joining us on this discussion on Gen Z voters and their voting habits. So I wanted to kick off with a question for all of the panelists. In your experience with outreach and campaigning, what issues do you find are mobilizing Gen Z voters to the polls? And how do these vary from the issues that are motivating members of other generational cohorts? Representative Slotkin, if you would
Sure.
kick us off.
Well, thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I think what we saw more than anything was the mobilization around the issue of choice this last election. In Michigan, we have a 1931 law on the books that was a total ban on abortion. So when Roe was overturned, we were facing the real prospect of becoming a state where all abortion was banned. The leak of the Dobbs decision gave us time to mobilize. We got 800,000 signatures in 8 weeks, almost 1 out of every 10 Michiganders, and got it on our ballot. So we had a ballot initiative to basically codify Roe. And that, I think, more than anything, was the mobilizing factor for a lot of people. Frankly, I would say more for older women than even for younger women, but certainly for younger women. And we ran a really extensive voter mobilization program at Michigan State, which I represent. And like immediately, the student organizers who were coming out to do paid voter registration shifts, overwhelmingly female. The early folks to register, like the ones who were the easiest to convince to register, overwhelmingly female. And we saw that issue on election night with 3.5-hour, 4-hour lines at both Michigan and Michigan State. And when you asked people, and we were buying them pizza and trying to keep people motivated, that was the one issue that was most important for a college student to wait 3 hours in line for. Yeah.
So what Voters of Tomorrow does, we do polling on a range of issues in swing states to determine how we structure our legislative agenda and also how we structure our messaging. What we found this year was that abortion rights and protecting them was the #1 issue for young voters in a lot of these swing states. We also found that gun violence and climate action, those were among the top issues. I think something that's overlooked potentially, though, is that young people are struggling really hard when it comes to building their wealth. Housing, education costs, and healthcare, they're all skyrocketing. That's one of the things we focus on, is being able to make sure Gen Z can buy a house, can get their education, get their healthcare. So it's a lot of issues that make up our what we call our Gen Z agenda, and those are the things we're fighting for, and that's the reason why young voters turned out.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Representative Slotkin and Jack both said, I think reproductive rights were the number one issue when it comes to Gen Zers and why we turn out to vote in 2022. And just to go back to University of Michigan and Michigan State, I was actually in contact with one of your staffers about the lines, and it was remarkable. I mean, Jack and I, we were both in DC, and we were trying to collect videos of different college campuses and how long the lines were. And by far, University of Michigan and Michigan State University were the longest lines. They stretched, I think, at University of Michigan, the last person to vote was around 2 a.m. So it was just amazing how many people turn out to vote. And when you ask them, they said reproductive rights and having abortion on the ballot was really critical. And we saw that before November 2, when Kansas went out and voted on their special referendum as well. You saw turnout skyrocket more than any other poll could have predicted. And so I thought it was pretty remarkable to see reproductive rights being on the ballot. But kind of like what Jack just said, I think what makes Gen Z so unique and why this election was, I think, different from other elections was that for Gen Z, there's so many issues facing our lives. For any young person, you know, it ranges from the cost of education to climate change to our current racial unrest. And so there are all of these issues that motivate Gen Zers. And I think kind of cumulatively, you see kind of what happened with abortion falling, but you also see what happens when elected officials actually pay attention to our lives and when you have an administration that actually cares about what we are facing. And so I think there's just a host of issues, and you can't really pinpoint one, but I think in this election, probably abortion rights was probably overwhelmingly the key deciding factor.
Can I add one thing?
Oh, absolutely.
So the reason why, so I'm both proud and saddened that we had the longest lines in the state,
Yep.
or in the country maybe. One, I'm thrilled that students felt motivated enough to wait in line in the cold,
Yes.
right, for 3 or 4 hours. But I think when we're talking about youth voting, so for me, some of the huge lessons learned was it's not about always an issue, it's about access. So in Michigan, we expanded our right to vote on the ballot in 2018, so we have same-day voter registration, which we never had. And I have to say, students are by far known as the more procrastinator group, right? So they weren't registered. So those lines were not for registered voters, they were for folks who were registering for the first time. If we did not have that in the state of Michigan, you would have lost thousands of voters. You wouldn't have seen those lines. But I think the story about getting more Gen Z folks out to vote is also about access and making it easy to vote. That morning of the election, we texted 40,000 students. And our plan was just to do peer-to-peer texting, send out a text, and then have those volunteers go knock doors. We started, we had a whole group of people just click in that day that was the election day. So they receive our text, and it says, remember, you can go to Bailey Hall, 8 to 8, the whole thing. And they started coming back to us like, wait, you didn't send me the link to vote online. Where's that link? And we're like, actually, you can't vote online. You have to go to Bailey Hall. And then we got Is the abortion initiative today and governor tomorrow? Nope, it's all today. Like, we did a ton of voter education via text the morning of, when people sort of clicked in. And I just think that's part of the story, is voter access and voter education, not just any single issue.
I guess following up on what you mentioned earlier about reproductive rights, specifically mobilizing women of all ages to the polls, did you find that with other issues as well, that talking about voter education as part of how you would introduce the issues, be it something like climate or gun control laws, was integral to getting them to really go to the polls, but also to engage with you on these issues?
Yeah, I think that, I really feel for a lot of the folks who, at least the college students in my district, because, you're a generation that has grown up not knowing what news source to trust. And so I got a lot of like, hey, I want to talk to you about what's on the ballot. It's abortion, it's climate, it's all this stuff. And they're like, well, but where do I find out more about this, and who can I trust? And how do you, the number of times I've been asked, how do you decide what to believe in the media? I think that voter education is certainly part of it. But I met a ton of students who are like, I don't screw with politics. I don't get involved. I don't like it. It gives me anxiety. It stresses me out. I don't know enough about it. I don't know where to trust. And so just as we have a highly mobilized group that's ready to come and vote, we also have a group that's like backing away really quickly. And I think we need to deal with both groups, basically.
Absolutely. And then, Jack, to a point you mentioned earlier about working to mobilize Gen Z voters in swing states more broadly, I feel like a lot of conversation about Gen Z voters can just end at Gen Z is on BeReal or Gen Z is on TikTok. But in actually crafting this messaging on social media platforms, what do you find actually resonates with Gen Z voters, and why these platforms are proving to be particularly effective in getting people engaged with politics?
So I think social media has really connected us, obviously, in a way like no other voter mobilization tactic has. Voters of Tomorrow, we ran all of our digital ads on either abortion rights or attacks on the LGBTQ+ community. That's what we found was most effective this cycle. But also, using social media as a tool is a great way for candidates to engage with young people who might not be showing up to panels like these, but who might be scrolling down their For You page and stumble upon a post from a candidate. I think that one thing that candidates get wrong about social media, though, is that we want to be entertained. We don't really want to be entertained. I mean, sure, we go to TikTok for entertainment, but that's not how we're voting. If I'm on my For You page, I'm not going to decide that I'm going to vote for a candidate based on if they're dancing or not. I'm gonna. I know, but that's what we see. I'm gonna be deciding if I'm gonna vote for a candidate based on the issues they're talking about, based on if they're just talking to us on social media, or if they're actually engaging with us, if they want to hear from us on social media. That's something that I think can actually be a really powerful tool, is when candidates talk to us about the issues and listen to us. Like the congresswoman said, actually educate us about the issues, not just do some funny dance and try to relate to us. But it can be way more meaningful than that, and that's what we're trying to do.
Victor, I had a question for you as well. Given that we've talked a lot about the online social media ecosystem being rife with lots of content, but also disinformation and polarized political dialogue, how do you break through these kind of mires of disinformation and be able to actually reach Gen Z voters? Or like Rep. Slotkin was mentioning, to be able to kind of cut through a lot of, I guess, the biased maybe that people feel that they get when they receive news media, or that when other people tell them to vote one way on a political issue?
That's one of the biggest challenges and I think problems facing our country today. I see my co-host Joe Linebanks is here, and we do a podcast that tries to bridge the two generations together. And one of the topics that we talk a lot about is what do we do about the level of misinformation and disinformation out there? We've asked a bunch of people about it. There really doesn't seem to be a clear answer yet, but I'm convinced that you need people who are going to go out there and just really tell the truth and the facts about what's happening right now. I mean, there's like Jack and like both Jack and the representative said, there is so much information out there. There's so much content, and for young people, it's about us knowing who to believe, who to trust. And I think that really depends on candidates doing a lot of the work, going out there on social media. We saw what happened in 2018. I think AOC was a big kind of transformation in terms of how candidates interact with the audience, going on streaming platforms like Twitch. These non-conventional platforms where Gen Zers are actually concentrated, I think is important for candidates to be on. We also saw that happen in 2021 when John Ossoff, as well as Reverend Warnock, went on different social media platforms and really did, on one hand, they entertained, but on the other hand, they also at the same time really promoted what their campaign was about. And I think it's about promoting the facts, really getting that out there. And I think just kind of going where Gen Zers are, when we talk about organizing Gen Zers, it's different from past generations. They aren't so much on the field. We aren't going to coffee shops and meeting with each other in person. Instead, it has to be on these digital platforms. And I think part of it is us knowing what responsibility we have as content creators and as candidates who are running for office, and being the people who kind of push back against those harmful narratives, at the same time promoting facts and really kind of having that as our core value.
I also wanted to get back at something that you mentioned earlier, which is, unfortunately, Gen Z has grown up with quite frequent mass shootings, seeing the effects of climate change, living through a pandemic. As much as we're talking about some issues really catalyzing voters to the poll, I even think something like 66% of college students voted in the 2020 election. And having increased voter turnout, there's still a large block of Gen Z voters who perhaps are feeling apathetic in the wake of all of these changes, and maybe as though they cannot make the difference they want to affect through electoral politics. How do you reach out to these voters or to these people who feel like they can't participate in the US's political system? I know you mentioned certain issues are particularly engaging for people who are on social media, but beyond that, how do you engage in substantive discussion or get people to actually believe in your campaign, believe in your messaging, and turn out to the polls?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and just to, again, if my district is a microcosm of the rest of the country, you know, in my district of 770,000 people, Michigan tends to skew a little bit older, but we had 90,000 individuals, voters, who are part of Gen Z, and 42% of them voted. I had 100,000, 110,000 folks who are 65 to 75 or 65 to 80, and they voted at 82%. So if you're a candidate and you're trying to figure out what your coalition is, particularly in a swing district, you are going to end up looking at the places where you know people are going to vote, right? It's why we tend to see all these campaigns still skewed older. But the crazy thing is, I'm a Democrat, is that 72% of the people who voted in Gen Z voted for a Democrat. So it's like this appetizing group who, as a Democrat, I mean, if young people voted at the same numbers as older people, they would run the Democratic Party. Their agenda would be the agenda of the Democratic Party. But because they don't vote in strong numbers, they're still fighting for space, right? So I think the issue I have is there's going to be a cadre of young people who are like motivated to vote, interested, whether they're Democrat, Republican, like just they're politically engaged. Then there's like the next ring, which is folks who are like political adjacent. Maybe they have a bunch of friends who are political, or they have friends who are involved in student government that has some sort of policy nexus. But then you start to get to the third and fourth rings of people who are like, they purposely stay away from all of that stuff. And they're like, my experience, especially we knocked on 80,000 doors, is it is peer pressure as much as anything else that is motivating people. Like, if all their friends are voting, they will vote. If they have someone who's like bothering them, this is why the largest number of Gen Z we've ever seen vote in the state of Michigan was 2020, not 2022 by proportion, because they're all home. They were home because of the pandemic, and they had like mom and dad bugging the crap out of them to vote, and they didn't have confusing like, am I moving, am I staying, am I going? They were sitting down. So there is, I think, I don't have a moral like purity test for someone on voting. I just want them to get into the habit. And so if peer pressure is the way to do that, and there's a concert going on and they all want to go to that free concert and they have to have I voted sticker, if that's going to be your entry into voting, I'm fine with that too. But I think we can't leave out those outer rings, because that's, at this point, half of Gen Z.
Jack, Victor, would you agree that peer pressure is a great mobilizing factor?
I do. I think, I mean, one thing that we've seen, it's not the fault of young people that they're feeling apathetic. And I'm not trying to place blame on anyone here, but it's really the fault of the system as a whole, because we see that, we've all heard that young people's voices don't matter in elections, young people don't vote, that saying, but the reason why that is because our voices have never been listened to. We've always been counted out of the process during the election, and then our voices aren't listened to when it comes to legislating. And I think if we take a step back, it's not about voting, it's about legislating, and legislating is what matters. It's not enough for politicians to only ask for our voices during election season. They have to ask for our voices year-round. But in terms of peer pressure, that's what it is. It's creating this larger social change. We talk about that a lot. It's about, everything is about politics. We all understand this because we're in this room, but really the root to every single piece of progress that we want to make, everything that we want to see in our country, the root to that is typically politics, and the first step of that is voting. So it's about creating this larger generational change, and I think Gen Z is finally starting to do that. We are the ones bucking voter trends, and I think we're going to keep building that momentum.
So just to quickly add on, I think one of the things that made 2022 unique when it came to organizing and reaching out to Gen Z was this new term called, maybe not new term, but a term that really kind of got into the political lexicon called relational organizing. And that's a different form of organizing from just trying to knock on as many doors as you can. Relational organizing really tries to put the individual at the center of the discussion. So when you're talking to someone, you're talking to them on a one-to-one basis. You start from a humane conversation, talking about their lives, what's going on, and then you start to move into politics. And one of the things that I thought was particularly effective in getting a lot of young people to turn out this election was peer-to-peer organizing and having those one-on-one conversations with different young people, a friend talking to their friend about why this election is important. That's what really, I think, got a lot of people to understand this moment, and I think kind of what made 2022 a unique election. And just to kind of go off your question about how do we have those conversations with young people, one of my biggest pet peeves about when we talk about politics is that we think what happens in DC is representative of the entire country, and it's really not. And it kind of gets young people to think about how there's this whole federal system, but we forget about what happens on the state and local levels. Those are the areas that I think are most kind of, when we talk about what happens on the state and local levels, that's when I think you can get Gen Zers, and especially young people, to realize that change is possible, that you can actually go to your maybe school board or your local government and testify and make change happen in a tangible way. And I think that sort of empowerment is all that Gen Z needs to feel like they can make a difference. But we don't talk about it in that way because we think what happens on the national scale is indicative, but it's really not. So to have those conversations with peers, I think, is important, but also in framing the conversation around what happens in our local municipalities. That's the area where I think change is most possible for young people to realize and see.
If I can add on to that really quickly, change is possible on the local level. I completely agree, and I think that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that a lot of these attacks that we're seeing launched against young people comes from the local level. It's the book bans. It's the attacks on abortion rights and education rights. If we see what's happening in Florida right now, that's completely happening on the local level, and we could stop that if we turned out young people in Florida in historic numbers like we did across the country. And if we continue to build on that momentum, especially at the local level, we can stop that from happening. Some state legislator races are decided by a couple hundred votes. And I think that's really where we are doing most of the brunt of our work is on the local level. It's having chapters on the ground. It's having young organizers at their schools. It's having young organizers meet their state legislators. It's having young organizers be elected to the state legislature themselves. I think that's really where we're seeing a lot of bad things happen in government, but like Victor said, change is certainly possible.
And just one last, I think to see that contrast, yes, I totally agree with you. What's happening in Florida and also other Republican states is concerning for a lot of young people to see education being under attack and all of that. But you also see the possibility of that just here in Illinois with Governor J.B. Pritzker and what he's been able to do in terms of passing reproductive rights. The other week he passed this historic gun legislation that banned assault weapons. So you see the possibility of change. And I think the contrast that you're seeing now is, I think what we're going to focus on heading into 2024 is seeing what's happening in the states where you do elect responsible, principled people into government versus the states where you really aren't. And that's, I think, the divide that we're seeing right now across the country.
I did want to complicate something that I guess both of you mentioned as well, which is that Gen Z voters currently are turning out at a higher proportion for Democrats. Despite this, something like 52% of Gen Z voters still identify as independent and are reluctant to align with either political party. And I know that you attributed this to a lack of maybe legislation being passed, but given all of the bipartisan legislation put through in the last kind of year, why do you think this is there's still some sort of lag between people's willingness to align with a political party or their candidates, and then to actually be able to, participate in these issues? I know there was some dialogue about the local level potentially being a solution to this. People may be getting involved in politics in their school boards or within their municipalities. But do you see this as being indicative of a larger mistrust that can't be solved just by legislation?
I think it actually, at least in Michigan, follows fact patterns that are going on for every age group. Our fastest growing affiliation in Michigan is independent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just a disdain with both parties and feeling like I have no home in either party and I don't like to just vote the straight ticket. I like to mix it up and go for the person and not the party, and so therefore I'm an independent, or I'm a libertarian, or I'm something else other than the one of the two parties. So, and it doesn't surprise me at all, right? I mean, I'm a Democrat who represents a Republican-leaning district, so the branding of, frankly, at this point, both parties is just not where the average person feels they are. They don't feel heard by it. They don't feel represented by it. And so they'd rather not be anything at all. And Gen Z has grown up in that environment, right? So there's a lot of people in Michigan who grew up as hardcore Democrats or hardcore Republicans and are sort of reluctantly going away from them. I think Gen Z's like, we never really had a home here, so why would we feel affiliated? But voting patterns tend to be much more Democratic, even if they don't feel like they're gonna go show up, at the DNC meeting with their Democrat card.
Would you like to?
I don't want to generalize for Gen Z, but I do think part of the reason why you're seeing a lot of young people vote, especially for Democrats, is because I think this is a generation that doesn't really, at least from the data, we don't attach ourselves to one political party. Instead, it's a lot about the issues and the values that are at stake. So when you think about this past election, just think about all the values that Gen Z says that they care about: abortion, climate change, gun reform. The party that actually delivered on those issues was the Democratic Party. You had the Republican Party, on the other hand, actively trying to strip away those rights. And so you see the contrast, I think, very clearly, and that's why when it comes to the issues that Gen Z cares about, that's what actually got us to vote, not so much because of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party label. And I think going forward with Gen Zers and millennials making up the largest voting bloc by 2024, you're going to see a lot of that. Both parties have to sell their message to young voters, and it actually has to come with real tangible results so that Gen Zers feel like their issues are actually being acted upon and addressed.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I
just
wanted to make sure we have time to get to all of our questions. So I did want to mention something else that or go back to something that was brought up in this conversation. Something I appreciate about this panel is we have a really good geographic representation of different areas. We have the Midwest, West Coast, East Coast. But to this point about issue-focused voting or issue-focused young voters, Texas and Florida are two of the most rapidly growing states in the United States, and yet have passed increasingly conservative policies that are overall polling unpopularly with young voters, including reduced access to abortion or perhaps broadened access to guns. How exactly do you reconcile this rightward shift in such young states with this issue-focused kind of voting behavior that you've mentioned? Is this demographic surge really going to prevent Texas and Florida from continuing to move rightwards?
I think so. I think young voters are, and John Della Volpe, he is at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and he said that something that I thought was really interesting, which is that young voters could be the ones to turn the Republican Party into a regional party. Because in these states that we're seeing historic attacks on young people are the ones fighting back. And young people, in the last election, there was 8 million new first-time voters in Gen Z. And we're going to keep seeing that number of Gen Z voters grow. And as that happens, and as far-right attacks increase, like you mentioned, I think the Democratic Party, we may not be registering with the Democratic Party, but in terms of voting, Democratic candidates might become the only solution for young people if this type of agenda continues in the Republican Party. And I think it's if Democrats want to keep winning, there's a way to do that. We see that young voters have all of this untapped potential. If we keep that same number the same, that number the same in terms of the margin by which young people are voting Democrat, which in the last election was 28 points for Democratic House candidates over Republican House candidates, but we grow that youth voter turnout number, there's so much potential there. And I think that's the job of the Democratic Party right now is to unlock that potential.
Yeah. I think that the thing, though, I will go back to is access. So if you're a student at University of Texas, Austin, and you're super progressive and you care about the same issues you care about that a student might care about at Michigan or Michigan State, and you wake up on election day and get a text and it's like, oh, right, crap, I thought I was going to vote at home, but I didn't get home, and so I'm now here, you cannot vote that day, period. So the voter laws in the states that are red are also designed to disenfranchise people so that those populations can't go. And in Michigan, and before 2018, we had the same thing. You were not allowed to vote absentee in your first election. Well, guess who votes absentee in their first elections? People who are 18, 19 years old and go off to college. That is designed, and we had my predecessor by 2 won his, he was a Republican who won his seat by 100 and some odd votes because Michigan State students could not vote by and large in that election. So I think that there is will, and then there is, administration. And I think that to me is an interesting, because in theory, Gen Z tend to be more democratic, and I hate to say this, they tend to be corralled in places like universities. Right? Do you know how much easier it is as a candidate to go to a university with boundaries and be like, okay, there's 14,000 students that live on campus. I know where to find them. I don't have to search hard. They're all there. I know where they hang out. I know their student center. But if they are not given sort of opportunity to vote in a way that is conducive with them, that's disenfranchisement. And let me tell you, if you had 4-hour lines of any other community but young people, it would be an ACLU suit. It would be disenfranchisement. If you had a 4-hour line of African Americans in downtown Detroit, we would jump on that as a legal matter of disenfranchisement. But because it's students, and because students tend to register late, we're like, oh, look at those kids waiting in line. Think about how many more, I think about this as someone who won by a landslide 20,000 votes, right? In a district of 780,000 people. I got 1,000 kids who voted the day of the election on Michigan State's campus. How many more would have voted if instead of 3 hours, it was 15 minutes? Who among us waits 3 hours? That's a hard thing to do. So I think there's also, there's a demand signal that should be going out on sort of, on issues and all the things that are sort of normal in politics, but also about law and how they, in many ways, feels targeted at disenfranchising young people.
I guess to your point as well, I'm from Texas myself, and that's why I'm so invested in the state, but in our last election, only about 25% of young people cast a ballot. Do you think that's solely attributable to reduced access in Texas?
No, it's not. It's like a perfect storm, right? Young voters tend to not be as good of voters, and that's not Gen Z. That's every generation, and we get better as we age. But I do think that we can't ignore that a student in Texas cannot wake up on election day and vote, and a student in Michigan can, and that's purposeful. So I just think it's both.
In Texas, at Texas A&M, I'll be quick. At Texas A&M, they actually removed the early voting poll site from the campus so that young people couldn't vote there. And Voters of Tomorrow actually helped fund a bus to take students to an off-campus poll site. It's not that they don't like that where people are voting, it's that they don't like who's voting there, which is students.
I just want to wrap up with 1 or 2 last questions to make sure that we have time to hear student questions. So for all of the panelists, what inspired you to do the work that you're doing now, both through electoral politics and organizing? And I think we have a lot of students in the audience. What's your advice to people who want to get involved with these national level projects or a local campaign and want to make sure that their voice is being heard?
So the reason why I got involved was because of a teacher. I think teachers are really the unsung heroes of democracy. They do so much. I was sitting in my 8th grade class in 2016, a couple weeks before the Iowa caucus, and my teacher just explained to the class the political spectrum and what it means to be a Democrat, what it means to be a Republican. And then at the end of that lecture, she said, as young people, you all have the power to make a difference. And at the time, I did nothing better than play video games and wasn't really interested in much else. So that really resonated with me, and that's how I got involved. And I got involved just on a local congressional campaign and volunteering, knocking on doors, making phone calls. And so part of my advice to young people is, first, there is no age too young to start. Second, just get involved on any level, on any campaign. The one thing about politics, I think, that is extraordinary is it's one of the true kind of last meritocracies left. If you get on a campaign, you go to a campaign center, even if it's a local election. I know the local mayoral election is happening pretty soon. Go there, demand that you get some work, make those phone calls, make those go to community centers, knock on doors. That's how you actually kind of rise through the ranks, and it starts on any level. Anyone can make a difference as long as you just start. That's the most important thing, I'd say.
I think I always grew up, well, obviously learning in civics class that 18 is the age to vote, and voting is how you get involved in elections. But why we're called voters of tomorrow is that although some of us are college age and we can vote, a lot of us are high schoolers. And we needed a way for young people to get involved that wasn't just by voting. And I think, like Victor said, it can be extremely meaningful to volunteer for a local state legislator who's fighting for your issues. And that's what I did. Like Victor, I worked on a local congressional campaign before I was 18, but I still made my voice heard in a different way. But that's how young people are still making a difference, even though they can't vote. So we actually just launched our Illinois chapter. It joins 25 other chapters across the country, and anyone here, I'd recommend getting involved through that. But really, it's about making your voice heard any way you can in our electoral system.
So I think for me, I was not involved in politics until 2016. And I was a CIA officer, a Pentagon official. I did 3 tours in Iraq. I worked for whoever was my commander in chief, and just the tone and tenor of 2016 felt so completely different than anything I had experienced on either side of the aisle that I just literally Googled like local Democratic club near my house in Michigan and was like, I'm going to go to this meeting for the first time. And
it worked wonders.
It worked, yeah. But I would say, just following the advice, though, every single person running, even a congressional campaign, you never have enough money, you never can pay enough staff, and so you're desperate for volunteers, and it is more of a meritocracy where, like, if you're 15 but you are ready to work hard, that person is going to be absorbed into a campaign. I just hired a young woman from South Chicago, and I'm looking at her resume, and she said, I started off in politics by being a finance assistant for one of a local congressional candidates, and I'm looking at her, I'm like, when? And she said, I was 15. And she would take the train from here up to the city and then walk to the commuter rail and take the commuter rail to West Chicago, and that's how she got involved. So you get the bug. And my staffer who's here with me now, she started with me as an intern at U of M. And she's now worked for my governor. She's back working for me. So you get the bug once you work on a campaign and realize that people just need people who are ready to work hard, and that is not an age-dependent situation.
Amazing. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us. And I think now we're going to hear some questions from the audience as well. So if you could raise your hand, some event ambassadors will come around and pass you the microphone.
Hi, is this okay? Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm a 4th year in the college studying public policy. One thing we talked a lot about today about trying to have Gen Zers have their voice heard, but I know Voters of Tomorrow just launched a super PAC, and I think money, we know, plays a big role in politics. So can you talk a little bit about why young voters need a super PAC? That'd be great.
So it's actually not a super PAC. It's a political action committee, a federal political action committee. You're right, money plays way too large of a role in politics. We've found that a checkbook is more influential than a vote, but it shouldn't be that way. I think What we're up against, though, is millions and millions of dollars going from to Turning Point USA as an example. On the far right, there's zero. The foundation of Turning Point USA is not young people. It's old experiences. It's reinforcing the status quo. But when the top 10 donors were ultra wealthy, anonymous donors to Turning Point USA, that's the kinds of things we're up against. So launching that was really just a way for us to make youth voices heard through more direct influence in local elections. But that's still coming from grassroots donors. It's not coming from places like ultra wealthy billionaires with Turning Point USA. We were founded by college students and we're remaining completely run by high schoolers and college students. But with that money, we're going to fight for candidates who are going to pass campaign finance reform. But it's about what we're up against, and I think it's a lot. The far right is a pretty powerful force that has a lot of ultra wealthy backing, and yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, guys. My name's RJ. I'm a third year in the college. I'm curious. I read an article this morning that went through the 25 most consequential tweets before the Musk era. And I believe the 24th was Hillary Clinton responding to a tweet from Donald Trump. I don't know what it said, but she responded saying, "Delete your account, period." And the point was that it was a really consequential tweet for a lot of older people, but a lot of younger people felt it was a little bit condescending because you could tell this was not Hillary Clinton sitting down with her phone and typing this out. This was a social media manager. So I'm curious, when you're talking about politicians engaging with these new digital platforms and doing it in a way that isn't just dancing on TikTok, how can candidates who might not necessarily be in the age group that's familiar with these new platforms communicate effectively without losing that authentic message that they're trying to convey?
I'll try that one, since it sounds like that I would be in a good position to answer that question. So I think we had to deal with this when you go from being a CIA officer to a political candidate, and where I had posted on social media 3 times in my entire life before I announced that I was running for Congress. I had a bunch of friends who were like, "Did you get hacked?" Right? Because they were so confused. And every candidate has to think about, like, how am I going to handle my public presence, particularly on social media, instead of like a speech where I delivered it, right? And I think what ends up happening is people hand it over to someone else, and you can tell. And part of the handing it over is to say, how do I appeal to this generation when I'm not part of that generation? And I think what I feel like I've learned in spades is that you can tell in a world that is very raised on social media and reality TV what is forced and purposeful versus what is just you being you. And so in my campaign, we are very rare that nothing goes up on social media or on an email if it's not either written by me or approved and edited by me. And therefore, it sounds different than my 22-year-old social media folks would probably write. But in the long run, I think I personally have decided that's much more effective. I think I look at I'm forgetting her name right now, the outgoing Prime Minister of New Zealand, right? She's not Gen Z, but she's younger than me, and she clearly handles her own social media. She does a lot of videos, a lot of direct to camera. That's way more effective than her handing that off to somebody to do perfect pictures that are Instagram quality every single time. And I think politicians are learning that the hard way. They're like spending a lot of money to pay someone to do it, and then it's not effective. They're like, why don't I go viral? Well, because what is central to virality, from what I can see as someone who doesn't go viral a lot, is like just an honest reaction to something or an honest moment, And I think that is, you can tell, and so can everybody else, when something is cultivated and handled by a manager. And I think, think about RBG becoming like a cult figure in her 80s, right? And she didn't try to be Gen Z. There was not 1 ounce of her that tried to be Gen Z. She was just like her fantastic self and had things to say and was funny. And she became a cult hero in her 80s. So go for that rather than be RBG trying to write a Gen Z tweet.
If I can pick up on that, I think there is such a value to authenticity. And one of the things that was mostly criticized for Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign trail was that she was so different behind closed doors with people she knew than out on the campaign trail on social media. And I think when you look at some of the really amazing people who have transformed digital spaces into something that young people can catch up on. I mean, think of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One of her defining hallmarks is that after some votes, she would go on Instagram and just do a live session where she explains things in a very direct way, in a very honest way. And I think there's an appetite for that for a lot of young people who, we spend our time on social media. We know what's curated. We know what's kind of, I guess, I don't want to say manufactured, but we know what kind of goes through a process versus something that's truly authentic and truly transparent. And I think you're seeing a lot of that now with even Maxwell Frost, who's the first Gen Z member of Congress. One of the things that he's doing that I think is totally just remarkable is he's actually shedding light on the process of government. He's being transparent about what it's like to be a House member. He's taking videos of himself yesterday, I think the day before, he was getting bagels from the Bagel Caucus, and he just posted that on Twitter. And I think it serves Gen Zers well. It serves the public well to know what's happening in our government, and he does it in a very direct way. It's him speaking in front of the camera in a selfie-style way, and I think people really catch on to that if you're your true, authentic self coming to the content that you push out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think social media extremely effective, and it's about championing our issues. It's about fighting for us, and that's what people want to see on social media. They want to see bills being passed. They want to see people disagreeing with people who are wrong. That's what it's about. I think if we can take a quick step back, though, from social media, very effective. But I don't want people to get the impression that that's the only way to reach Gen Z voters. And I think the Congresswoman understands this very well, having invested heavily on-campus organizing with young organizers. That's what we're seeing be an extremely effective route to reaching young people. So it's about the culmination of all of these steps that we take to reach young people, whether that's social media, that's text banking, phone banking, volunteer, relational organizing. It's about all of that together.
Great. Yeah. Could we get another? Okay, we have a student in the back.
Yes. Hi. My name is Mike. I'm a first year at Harris. And I'll preface my question by saying that, one, I don't like Turning Point, with the footnote that Candace Owens is from my hometown. And I'm also a Democrat who's really involved in Connecticut politics. And even though I'm a Democrat and I love when Democrats win, I'm also deeply troubled that for Gen Z, it's so one-sided. And so I'm wondering, sort of picking up on the conversation earlier about Republicans not really responding to issues. What's sort of the outlook you think in the next 10 or 20 years for the Republican Party? Can they actually talk to Gen Z? Because there are lots of young Republicans, and also I think there's a lot of political alienation and whatnot. And even on a campus, you'll hear someone say they're a Republican, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, whoa, what are they about to say?" But it turns out they care about the same issues as well.
Right.
I love my GOP friends. So.
Yeah, Voters of Tomorrow is nonpartisan for a reason, and that's because young people do fall across the political spectrum. We do lean Democrat, obviously, and that's why, Voters of Tomorrow, we don't want to just assume anything about young people, but we actually do those polls. They may cost a lot of money, but we do those polls to find where young people stand on a range of issues. So I think the country is better when we have a strong Republican Party, when we have, when there's a reason for Democrats to listen to young people, because we do need to hear they need to hear our voices, and so when there's that competition, it's a good thing. But in terms of the outlook for the Republican Party, if they'll be able to hold on to any young voters that they still have, I think Gen Z candidates like Caroline Leavitt, who lost her congressional race in New Hampshire's 1st district, she's saying the same thing as we're saying. We might completely disagree on a lot of political issues. She wants to ban the Department of Education, but we're saying the same thing, which is that the Republican Party, I think, needs to take a step back, and they actually, if they want to reach young voters, they need to meet them where they're at, which is not these far-right ideologies, but it's actually talking to young people, and it's about hearing from us and investing in us, because we've seen that investing in youth organizing actually works. So I think both parties, if they want to unlock the untapped potential of young voters, we know how to do that.
Yeah, I think we just have to be a little bit careful about living in our own echo chambers. I represent Michigan State. That is not a liberal campus. That is not a place where anyone would feel ashamed saying that they're a Republican. And I haven't done the polling, but Candace Owens had the biggest event on Michigan State's campus last year. Wow. So I think we have to be careful that sort of there's certain places in the country and certain institutions that maybe like the culture is different, but that doesn't represent the majority. And I don't know that the Republicans are doing a terrible job of reaching out to Gen Z people. I really don't know much about it, but I don't think they're doing a terrible job. And I think we just, 9% of my district's on Twitter, right? If I want to communicate with the majority of my district, and really the most effective way to do that is television, which most of you probably don't watch like at home, and you certainly don't like clicker through the way I grew up watching TV. Maybe you stream online, but you don't just like see the ads in the middle of broadcast TV. That's still the number one way to change the situation in the state of Michigan because we skew older. And so we just have to make sure that, with social media, that we're not living in our own silos of excellence, as we call them, where we think everyone around us is thinking the same thing, and therefore everyone in the country does. I just don't think that's right, even for Gen Z.
I think we have time for one more student question, if we can get one.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm also a first year at the Harris School of Public Policy. And I'm curious, sort of the question on communications. I feel most days like if we're sitting around waiting for politicians to figure out how to speak to Gen Z, we're wasting our time. And so I'm curious, like especially on the issue of gun violence, how we as Gen Z just change the narrative ourselves rather than waiting for politicians to figure out how to change it.
I will say I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think a stereotype of Gen Z is that like you're waiting for people to come to you and like realize that you're important, when the American history of civil rights movement, voting rights movement, gay rights movement, women rights movement is that if you sit around and wait for people to pay attention to you, you'll be sitting a really long time. And it actually, if we learn the lessons of the best activism in our country, including in the 60s when people who were young were changing the course of history, that was a in the streets activist moment. And so I absolutely, I think the thing that is powerful, particularly on gun rights, I had a gun legislation issue. I had a school shooting in my district about a year ago, and then last week had a really sophisticated hoax where someone called and said, I'm a teacher, I'm inside, it's going on right now. Horrible. The power that young people have when they do show up and like physically demonstrate in front of people who feel uncomfortable when children are confronting them is really powerful. And you saw what happened in Florida, right? Parkland, horrible situation. They've done more in Florida to change based on that event than most states that I know. And it's because think of the round table, the public conversation where young people were leading. Never underestimate the power of young people in shaming old people. But I think it has to be more, it can't be in the silo of excellence. It's not a Twitter conversation. You're not going to change 10 senators' minds in Washington, D.C. by being really angry on Twitter. You're going to need to be in their space. You're going to need to be confronting them with the reality that they are literally not keeping children safe and let them live with that shame. Right now, they're going to see more NRA activists in their office than they are young people. You have the power to change that, but that to me, if you're asking, that's how you change the narrative.
Jack, Victor, would you like to add to that?
I totally agree. I think when you look at what's happened over the past few years with really important movements, gun violence, climate change, those are all movements started by young people. You think of David Hogg, you think of Greta Thunberg. Those are all people who had, they weren't the oldest, they weren't the most experienced, but they had a voice and they used their voice for better. And I think I totally agree with you. I think if we're waiting for politicians to change their narrative around Gen Z, we're wasting our time. I think politicians and elected officials will change their narrative because of our voices and because of what we do. We have power when it comes to these spaces, and it's up to all of us to use our voices and be there. And I think elected officials, if they're smart, they will pay attention and they will actually change what they're doing.
I think Gen Z started bucking voter trends from the first cycle in which we could vote, which was 2018. So 2018, 2020, 2022, we changed the narrative. And it's not like politicians asked us to vote, because historically there's been very little youth voter outreach. But we did it, and now politicians are seeing that they really can't win without us in some areas. So I think we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to harness our power. And really, we're going to wait for no one.
Amazing. Thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us for today's event. As always, please talk to some of the U.S. Vote students that we have here if you're curious about voting in Chicago's upcoming municipal election. And let's give our panelists a round of applause for joining us today.